We have Nate Gray on the podcast. Nate is the entrepreneur in residence for Harvard Alumni Association, an incredibly successful entrepreneur, built a gaming company, done an incredible amount of stuff. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kunal. It's great to be here.
Nate, so you work with startups, you've built your own startup. What's your journey been like?
The journey began for me long before COVID. When I built a platform that connected writers and publishers, right? And I built that from ground zero, right? I spent about $200 of my own money, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but 200 can quickly become 1,000 if you deploy it right? And then 1,000 can quickly become 10,000 if you deploy that right. So I was incredibly lucky. It took a little bit of luck, a little bit of smarts, and a lot of hard work. So, and then I sold that company after about 5 years. And I got a little bit bamboozled in the deal, but that's okay. So you learn from your mistakes, right? And you use those funds to build something either bigger and better or just different, right? It doesn't always have to be bigger and better. And so I've started a gaming company called Wingnut Digital and have built it out to a successful venture.
So I think it's just so cool to have had gone through multiple ventures, because you kind of get this broad outlook of how that iterative process from coming up with an idea to getting to an MVP to getting to an actual company. How would you describe that process?
Oh, very good, very good. So I think a lot of times the idea stage can be the hardest for an entrepreneur, right? Because you have to essentially pick a lane, so to speak, right? And the problem with picking a lane is that there's so much opportunity, so many different ideas, right? And so many ways you can go that it can be hard to choose between tracks. And so once you have the idea, the trick is to really stick with it, right? Don't give up. And you can pivot. That's not to say you can't, the idea won't change and the company won't change, right? You can pivot, but you can both stay on track while pivoting in a way. Because if you do a complete 180, you might lose the interest of innovators and investors. So yeah, and then sorry, to answer the second part of your question, to get from the idea stage to the beta stage, a small product that's maybe $10,000 is good enough for a beta. And a beta is not going to be perfect. That's the point of a beta. But it's something that you have that you can show investors, and investors can sort of get a sense of what your idea is applied. You apply, you make your idea a reality. Even though it's version 1.0, it's still a tangible thing that investors can see. And sometimes even before that, you have a business plan and a pitch deck and other material to help guide in the development of not only the business as a whole, but also specifically the beta.
I love that. And talk a little bit more about when you were building your first company, what was the iterative process like to get to product market fit?
So a lot of failure, right? So when we first came out with our version 1.0 beta, we were frustrated because people weren't coming into the doors, right? Yeah. People weren't spending money; they weren't pulling up their pocketbooks, right? And so we were frustrated. So we had to really put our heads together and think, okay, what's wrong with this execution, right? Is it the product? Is it the entire idea, right? Or is it the marketing? Have people just not caught on? Have we not gotten the word out, right? And so what we found is that it was sort of a combination of everything, right? It was that we didn't have the marketing to draw people in, right? To then gather the feedback, to do the data mining that was needed to improve that product, right? And to improve that version 1.0 to make it a 2.0, to make it a 3.0, to iterate, right, on the initial idea. So it's sort of a marriage of a lot of things that come together to get that product out the door and improve upon it, right? It's not just releasing a beta and sitting there and twiddling your thumbs, right? You've really gotta continue to improve upon it.
So I think one of the easy, like for a new founder, someone who's still figuring the ropes out, first-time founder, where do you think he should spend time and where do you think he shouldn't spend time?
That's a really good question. I think first off, you have to make a point of deciding how your life is going to look when you become a founder, right? So you could spend 100% of your time, with the exception of sleeping, on being an entrepreneur, right? And that's great, and you can be very motivated and be very ambitious. However, you're going to burn out, right? It's not going to be a very fun existence, right? And so I think what you need to do is you have to cultivate yourself, right? Like cultivate your interests, right? And they can be related to what you're doing startup wise. So if your startup is in the art space, right? You can go to museums and cultivate it that way, right? Or if it's in, say, the dog walking space, right? You can spend a lot of time with your pet and go to dog parks, right? So there are ways that you can spend time that are semi-related to your startup and building your startup, but also make yourself a fuller person too. So I think that's a very tricky question of how do you spend your time, because the lines, I think, are blurry. And they should be. They should be.
No, it's just so complicated because as a founder, there's like everything you need to do, and there's always an opportunity cost.
Yes, that's pretty much the name of the game, and this might be the theme of our podcast, right? Or the theme of our class here is that there's an opportunity cost with everything, right? And that's why, and I know it's been said before, but that's why, in my opinion, time is much more valuable than money, right? Everyone knows you can't get the time back, right? And so you have to just decide whom you're spending your time with, right? That's very important. And then also when you can't be spending it with another person or other people, how you're spending your time. And that's not to say all time has to be accounted for. Sometimes just sitting and daydreaming for maybe not for 3 hours a day, but for a short amount of time is a good way to help yourself on the road to success.
I love that. Yeah. But talking more on ideation.
Yeah.
When you're coming up with ideas, just as founders, there's a sense of being naturally very inclined towards creativity. How do you go about looking personally on your end, looking at what ideas to pick up?
That's a good idea. And what comes with that question is how do you distinguish a good idea from a bad idea, right? And in my opinion, bad ideas are only one iteration away from being a good idea. Because even the craziest idea, there's a reason why someone would sort of blurt it out, right? Or when you're brainstorming, right? When you're brainstorming, you have what someone would go, oh, that's a terrible idea. Well, there's the seed of something there, right? And a lot of it is instincts. Like if I have an instinct and I think this is going to be a good idea, I can, but I just haven't molded it yet. I haven't put it in the type of framework that it needs to succeed. Sometimes it's just about experimenting, right? experimenting with that quote bad idea and figuring out why people might not be responding to it, right? Whether it's on the brainstorming phase, whether you're just in a boardroom talking about it with other entrepreneurs and other investors, or in the beta stage, right? In the experimentation stage, and getting feedback from the users and figuring out, oh, why isn't there a market for this? There should be a market for this. And sometimes the best companies create a new market. And as we know, sometimes the craziest ideas are the best ideas. And what I found is usually what happens is if someone has a crazy idea, so to speak, it really just needs to be simplified. And because sometimes I think founders like to overcomplicate, and I do this myself. You overcomplicate, and so you need to simplify those ideas.
I love that. So talking now, moving from your facet as a founder to your facet as an EIR and as an investor.
Yeah.
What's your outlook here when you look at startups?
In terms of
ideas,
what do I look for? Well, it's mostly about the founder, right? Mm-hmm. It's mostly about the founding team and the people that they have, right? So what I look for is a track record of success, right? And it can be modest success, but a track record of success, a twinkle in the eye, so to speak. I know that's very unbusinesslike, but something that says, "Oh wow, there's some excitement behind this idea," right? It's not just a one-off, right? There's a real excitement, a desire to help people generally, right, and a love for people. But you can both like people and have a sort of a healthy skepticism of them too, which I think drives entrepreneurs. Some entrepreneurs love people, and some are misanthropic in that they're skeptical of mankind, and that's why they want to set out on their entrepreneurial journey so they can make things better. So, yeah.
That's what I often think about, that balance between everything, balance between hiring and still making sure you're not overlooking productivity. That balance between being loving and still being skeptical.
Yes. Yeah, it's always a balance, and you want to be productive, but not overwork, like you said. And you want to make money, but not have it be just about the money, right? And then you want to like your product immensely, but you don't want to fall in love with your product, because if you fall in love with it, you're not going to want to change it. And the nature of entrepreneurialism, especially in the tech space, is constant change, and you have to look out for that and be prepared for that.
I love that. Talking more about like just the very phase of getting started again, like the phase now if you have a crazy idea and you want to go and build it, what's the first thing you do?
If you have a crazy idea and you want to build it, that's a very good question. I think the first thing you do is you put it down on a piece of paper. It doesn't have to be on the computer. It doesn't have to be on a notebook. It can be on the back of a napkin. Put it down on the back of a napkin. A few simple things, right? Your idea, encapsulated in about a sentence or two, right? The goals for your idea, both monetarily and in the greater ecosystem of that industry, and then put that notebook or napkin or file in a drawer somewhere and forget about it for 2 weeks, right? And then come back to it. And when you see it again, if it's still as attractive to you as it was the first time you wrote it down, then you know you have a good idea. Because it stood the test of, not a lot of time, only 2 weeks, but it stood the test of, I was drinking when I came up with this idea, right? Which you never want to do.
That's super. It's amazing because it's also, as a founder, you have to commit for a long time.
Yeah.
And knowing that you're not going to get bored in 2 weeks.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You have to, and you can take it out occasionally before those 2 weeks, but you have to, you have to let it sit a little bit.
So, when you built your first company, what did you think were like some of those shifts that you had to make to get into the founder phase for you?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things you have to do is you have to, again, it's a bit of the dualism of being an entrepreneur. You have to both be very ambitious and have a great amount of confidence, but you can't be overly egotistical. You almost have to have no ego, right? Because when you start, you're going to realize that your ego will be tested, right? And if everything is pinned on, your ego and self-worth, you're going to have trouble, right? That said, you have to have the confidence to keep going, and despite the failures and despite the rejections, right? I think getting started is you have to take a look at yourself and be like, okay, am I ready, right? That's one of the issues. And then another thing is the world ready? If you have your idea, right? Just because it's a good idea to you, just because you need a new mousetrap, doesn't mean the world does, right? So,
how do you do that check of seeing if the world is ready?
That's a really good question. I'd say just market testing, right? I mean, obviously you can get to the stage and build the beta, and that's one of the ways. But if you're not at that stage yet, and if you're really at square one, I would say speak to friends and family, speak to random people on the street even. Sometimes the best market research happens just in a coffee shop, right? You can strike up a conversation with people and just get their feedback, right? And then there's also just the simplicity test, which I talked about a little bit before. If it's too complicated, and if it takes you a couple minutes just to describe the idea, you probably need to either reassess the whole idea entirely or reassess how you describe the idea. Because anything worth doing you should be able to boil down anything worth doing into just a couple sentences.
That's very well said. I love the simplicity test, because the beauty of the simplicity test is how simple it is.
Exactly. Right.
When you work with startups, what's the craziest idea you've come across?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think the craziest idea I came across was, an entrepreneur wanted to build a television this might exist, wanted to build a television where you could smell and feel what was happening on the screen as if just like the volume worked. Be careful about listening to naysayers. Don't listen to the naysayers, right? Because at the beginning, nothing you do is gonna work, or nothing you do is gonna look great, right? And it's going to fail. You're going to have to go through extensive testing. You're going to have to go through extensive safety checks, right? And extensive government regulation too. They're going to want to try to generally regulate your industry if it's going to become a big thing. And so in the beginning, I would say keep going despite failures or roadblocks. And then I would say when you've been at it for like 5 or 6 years and the product is still not working, there's no fit, there's no product market fit, there's no real traction either with investors or customers or anyone. I think that's when you have to look at the numbers and be like, okay, we've gotten all this research back from our from data, from our data mining, and this is what it's telling us, and we have to face reality and either pivot the product or pivot the whole company, or not even pivot, just decide, hey, this is we've developed technology that maybe we can sell and we'll start over, right? So I think that's a hard truth that entrepreneurs have to face, unfortunately, but it's good because a lot of entrepreneurs should just pay attention to the market and the data. So that was a long-winded answer.
No, I love that. I think it's so important for founders to know what they're getting into.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's good. And I think one way to do that is to speak with other entrepreneurs and listen to podcasts, read books, and join and even speak with non-entrepreneurs, even speak with just people in the subject matter, engineers, artists, people who might work for you someday.
So talking more about people figuring out the next step. Being an entrepreneur, you're always so active on your feet. Next step.
When you're thinking about the next step, regardless of which stage you're at presently, sometimes what you want to do is go get the advice of experts. And I think that's always smart to do, to get the advice of experts. But when you're listening to experts like me and you also have to remember to take it with a grain of salt, right? Because there are a million things to do. There are a million ways to succeed, right? And everyone has their own way. But you have to figure out the way that works for you, right? So you might be a morning person. You might be a night person. You might need a huge amount of capital up front. You might need a small amount of capital up front. You might work well alone better, and you might work well in teams better. So you have to figure out what works for you and go forward that way. But the one thing that is consistent almost always with entrepreneurs is that they can't do it without some help. And it doesn't mean, just because you don't work well in teams doesn't mean you won't be able to use that help. Because there are other ways that they can help through phone calls and events. So figure out your own way of succeeding, but realize that it's quite hard to do alone.
What would be podcasts and books you recommend for entrepreneurs?
Oh gosh. So the book I like to cite is a book by Bo Peabody called Lucky or Smart. And it's something I like to echo and steal from occasionally, because it really answers that central question. As a successful entrepreneur, are you lucky or are you smart? And what he comes up with is, generally the thesis of the book is, I'm a little bit of both, right? You have to be very, very smart to be an entrepreneur, but smarts alone isn't going to help you succeed, isn't going to help your business succeed. So that's a book I'd recommend. It's a very easy read. It's very short, but I think it encapsulates what it takes to be a good entrepreneur. It also shows you how a good entrepreneur thinks, in that a good entrepreneur is able to hold your attention with their storytelling. So,
before we wrap up, I have a personal question for you. On a personal end, what was your most memorable story in building your company?
the most memorable story that I have when building my company is probably, that's a really good question. And I think waking up at 5 a.m. every day and just grinding and grinding and grinding until I was able to finally find some success. And I wish I had a better story about meeting Steve Jobs or something. I think the entrepreneur has to keep in mind that even though there's a saying, I think it was by Einstein, that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. That can be true, but then there's also the adage, if at first you don't succeed, try again, right? And so you have to figure out where you fall, what your belief is. Do you keep trying, or do you realize that persisting is just a form of insanity, and that it's time to give up or pivot?
It's always just the idea of pivoting in itself is so hard often.
Yeah, because it admits well. That's the thing. You can't look at it as admitting failure, right? Pivoting doesn't mean you have admitted failure, right? It's recognizing that there's something that's maybe not working, and you have to
Fixing it.
Yeah, fix it.
So when do you think you should put Scotch tape on it, and when do you think you should cement it?
That's a good question. I think I think a lot of that you'll know when you get there. A lot of times you just go with your gut, and I think cement it when you have feedback that makes sense to you, right? Cement it when you have the numbers, right? And I think when you put Scotch tape on it, it's to get those numbers, right? Yeah. Be like, okay, it's not working great, but we need it to work to get the feedback, to get the data, so we can figure out how to respond to that data, right? Because more information is key. You need more information, not less.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Any additional advice you'd have for a founder still figuring out whether starting a company is his thing, and he has an idea he wants to build, but he's still in that?
I'd say after my 2-week rule, which is put the idea down, wait 2 weeks, I'd say after that, don't delay too much, right? You don't need to figure everything out at first, right? You have to get a product out the door. You have to get people on your team. And you just have to start, right? So start, fail fast, as they say, and you'll eventually find your niche or your groove. And it's not going to be easy, and it shouldn't be easy, but you have to. If you have a choice between thinking about it and doing it, do it. Kunal, would you have anything to add? I want to ask you one question. What to you is the single most interesting part, has been the single most interesting part of your entrepreneurial journey?
That's so. I love going down the memory lane. For me, it's probably realizing that a lot of things that people think are not possible are very possible.
Yes.
A lot of things that people think are very obviously possible are a lot harder to do. It just the people's estimation of reality is very not correct often. What people estimate to be reality, is often so very different from actual reality.
You never know, right?
It's you realize all your assumptions falling on their back and breaking when you get into the journey, and you start building, and you're like, oh, I thought this was right, but you're like, no, this is completely messed up. And I thought, it's also it's same with people so many, and it's also having a good community helped me a lot getting along the way.
That's a good point. I think the community helps, and you can take cues from them too, right? And so you find when one week you're failing, there other people will either reach out to you or you can reach out to them, and hopefully make something happen. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And have a good amount of fun, I think.
I think, yeah, if you have to keep everything in perspective. That's probably the one of the greatest talents that a good entrepreneur can have, is keeping perspective.
Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you, Kunal.